is King Boss, and as I always do, I roll around with royalty. And today is no exception. I have a queen in the building, Felicity Sibindi. She has a composition. If I have to try and summarize what she does, I don't think I'll be able. I will allow her to introduce herself. Welcome to the show, and may you quickly introduce yourself.
Hi, Ngabuto. Thank you for having me. I'm a public health practitioner. I've been working in the public health space for 13 to 15 years now. I started off in the rural health sector in Zimbabwe, in rural Matabeleland North and South, before I transitioned to more general public health across Africa, in West Africa and East Africa, looking specifically at reproductive health, but also issues that affect women, primarily issues of gender-based violence, issues of feminist activism, issues of policy spaces and women's access to things like land, economic resources. So yeah, that's who I am, and that's
Exactly. I'm glad I saved myself from that. Yeah, so every year from the 25th of November to around the 10th of December, we focus on gender-based violence, on 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And we'll try and get into that and talk about gender-based violence. But I would like to try and pick your mind on a few issues also that are around the subject of being a woman and the things that you face, especially being an African woman, and the stuff that you face back home. And maybe let's start with the fact that you call yourself African feminist, and most people seem to understand this as if it's an abstract concept that applies to everyone the same way, whichever place they come from. It doesn't seem to matter, but you chose to define it as African feminist. What does African feminist entail?
Sure, that's a good question. Feminism is often understood as this broad hegemonic term that covers women wanting to be equal, women wanting to have power or more power than men. And I think for me, African feminism is something very different than the usual Western feminism. So when you're looking at feminism in the West, it came up when women were trying to get the right to vote, when women were trying to get the same rights in terms of labor, same pay as men. It started off actually with African American women before it got co-opted by white women in America, who then of course took over. But it was really centered in terms of a capitalist framework, in terms of a means of production, in terms of earning money. Whereas African feminism is more looking at the more holistic approach to what makes an individual, the more contextual factors that attribute their impact in our lives. For instance, African feminism looks at the geography of a person, so where a person is located, the history of that space. So for us as Africans, the history of colonialism, the history of Africa before the white man, so our traditional customs and systems, and the position of women within society before whiteness entered our lives. It looks at current economic factors affecting Africa. It looks at the access to resources. It looks at climate. It looks at a whole broad range of issues, not only the capitalist element of how much is a woman earning, or issues of violence, which are also very closely tied to capitalism. So African feminism, particularly the one which I subscribe to, which is Tiwanism, is really looking at context-based factors affecting women.
Awesome. Yeah, still on feminism. I've been in conversation with different friends of mine, especially female friends, on the subject of equality between men and women. What does it entail, and are there the do's, are there don'ts in this concept? One thing that we seem not to agree on, for example, is if we go out, who is supposed to pay? Why is it that even a question? Why don't we go out and whoever has money it pays? Or if we go out, if it means sharing the bill, why don't we just share the bill? Because if it's the man who's always paying, you are still upholding the principles of the concepts that you're against, which is patriarchy and which are against feminism. So why do you want to pick the what becomes feminism and say, okay, this concept is bad, but you can still benefit here? And talking on who pays, I think it's a transfer of power, or it's acknowledging that someone has power more than you. So I don't know what would be your comment on that.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it goes back to the Western type of feminism. How do we define feminism in the first place? So you're mentioning a transfer of resources, specifically a transfer of money. You're mentioning a situation which is not common to most Africans. So going on a date is not something that the majority of Zimbabweans do. So if we think about the fact that the majority of Zimbabweans are in rural spaces, they're not going out to, I don't know, Belvedere to have a drink or to KFC or something. So that's a challenge of the wealthy, the relatively wealthy. I say wealthy in quotes in Zimbabwe. I'm not sure anyone is even wealthy anymore. But when we're looking at those type of spaces, we first have to acknowledge, if we're looking at an African perspective, are we talking about everyone, or are we talking about a small percentage of the people? So, and in that small percentage, is that small percentage truly a representation of Africa, or are they aspiring to this more global idea of what is important in life? Are they aspiring to a global idea of, like the diamond ring, the man proposing with a diamond ring, the things which are not even from our culture, things which are sort of imported by TV, by media. So that's the first consideration one has to think of. And then looking specifically at the power relation of a man paying a high bill, and then the obligation, the relationship of obligation that comes after. So where there's an exchange of resources, we're assuming that something comes back. So we are hoping that a man who takes a woman on a date, the exchange is her company. Yeah. But this often gets corrupted, right? A feminist would say, okay, the man has no obligation to that woman's body. We also have to remember that we're living in the real world, and as much as there shouldn't be any expectation of a physical transaction. Say a man pays for a date and then expects sex. That shouldn't be the norm. But we know that this happens, and we know that there's an additional pressure if money has exchanged hands. And so by acknowledging that reality, we have to say, okay, so what are we dealing with here? Is it a space where a woman is empowered? Is it a space where she even gets to meet the man himself, or is she meeting his money? And we have to also look at our context, our economic context. In a lot of African countries, especially in urban spaces, financial resources are really difficult to come by. So you have women who are in ever more desperate circumstances. Holy Ten sings about this, about the girl child, and the need to make money, the blessers and the troubles that come with blessers. And we have to accept that that is a structural issue. And this goes back to what I was saying about African feminism, looking at the context of problems. So the fact that the girl child or the woman who's going on this date is looking out for financial stability when it comes to who she's dating, that's already pointing to a key structural factor which we need to fix. If women are not able to get resources on their own, which would provide them security where they don't have to look at a man's financial pocket when it comes to the dating scene, then we've already solved that problem before it happens. But if we don't solve the overarching problem, so if we don't solve the economic challenges we're facing as a country, we'll never be in a place where women can go on dates and not worry about how much, first of all, he's spending, and grade men according to their pocket. So that's the mixing of capitalist ideals and this capitalist landscape that we're living in, our economic meltdown as nations in Africa, and the aspiration to Western ideals, the aspiration to Western ideas of success as well. So it's all a context-based issue, and finding a way of navigating that honestly while maintaining our safety is also part of African feminism. Feminism is acknowledging where we have weaknesses and then seeing how we can bridge and fix those challenges.
Fine. And then now coming to Africa as a continent and building a narrative that we want. We seem like most of the times we have given this responsibility to anyone else but ourselves. I once posted something to say, if we are to have a correct narrative as Africans, we need to bring this talking. Because now it doesn't matter what it is that we do. It seems like there's someone else who who is an authority, how do we take back this narrative as a society, as a country, or even how does the government even actively involve itself in trying to correct these narratives that seem to take away from what we're defined as and what we've accepted a black man to be, what we've accepted a black woman to be. How do we show our power? How do we show who we are?
That's a difficult one. How do we tell our stories in an authentic way? I think in a way we've started. For me, what is really encouraging is to see the art scene growing. I think arts and culture are something that are often, coming from a Zimbabwean context, often overlooked in terms of their impact on society. But I see countries like South Africa, Nigeria, where arts and culture are really storytelling is part of the tradition, part of something considered important in society. So I see this happening slowly. I see artists coming up. I mentioned Holy Ten already, who's speaking about the issues on the ground as they are. Captain Formbi, who has a comedic outlook on the same issues. I think he's really impressive in what he's doing now. I think being able to tell our stories in our own creative way helps us to be honest with ourselves. It helps us to move away from the wishes. Before we were always imitating someone else. I see this happening. I speak more from a Zimbabwean perspective, where we were taking beats from other countries, be it Niger beats, be it dancehall beats, be it R&B, hip hop beats. Now I see that we're coming back to ourselves and finding a local sound. And I think that's really important in terms of expressing our own issues and relating to ourselves and being honest. I think once you're honest with your challenges, just like if you're an alcoholic, if you can't admit that you're an alcoholic, you can never recover. So in the same way, by talking about our issues openly, it helps us to provide a space for us to recover from those issues. I don't think our politicians are anywhere near that. I think we are still playing to outside influence, playing to selfish influence, playing to fear when it comes to the political landscape. So I don't think African politicians in general, save for maybe Kagame, who's trying, but I think we have a massive insecurity within our African leaders. I'm not sure whether they're ready to have an honest conversation about who they are, why they're there, and what they're doing. And so politically, I'm not seeing that. But I think the youth of today are telling their stories. You see it also in terms of our social media. You see how people are having honest conversations on Twitter. They're having conversations on Facebook. I would say the Twitter space in terms of politics and the thought patterns about what is happening, the current event thought patterns, is a great space. We see it in Nigeria with the End SARS campaign, which was harking from the Black Lives Matter movement, and how that affected politics in Nigeria in terms of the role of the Nigerian police. At the same time, we have to be careful when it comes to social media and our voices on social media. It's important that we say what we need to say so that we raise awareness, so that we raise community. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're bridging it to practical actions. Something can get lost in a hashtag and then it just disappears into the air. So I think it's really good to take advantage of the opportunities we have, meeting country to country. Before, we used to be very isolated. Now being able to talk on social media, we have that community, but what does that practically mean on the ground? What does it mean when it comes to changing policy? What does it mean when it comes to actually bread and butter issues? So that's something I don't have a solution for, but so long as we're telling our stories, maybe someone within our midst will have the solutions for them. So I really think there's a great space and a great change happening already within that space.
Awesome. Yeah. Now coming to gender-based violence is something that has somehow been relegated to be something that only happens in Africa, but which is actually not true. I can put an example of UK, for example. When lockdown happened, there were many cases of women that were dying at the hands of the people that they love. And this lockdown, instead of bringing people together and seeing love, seeing caring, seeing people that show that they're family, it has almost done the opposite. And this is a reality that we have. And we have many cases across Africa, across Latin America, in America, and I think it's underreported, so to say. So where do we go, and whose responsibility is it to take these issues? Because sometimes I think it's because we assign certain people instead of it being something that we actively get involved, all of us.
Well, gender-based violence, especially now COVID, I agree with you. when it comes to Africa is painted as the big bad. You see it now with Omicron, in terms of everyone thinking, okay, it came out of Africa, so it must be the worst COVID variant. Whereas as much as it's transmitting super fast, we're not sure whether it's more severe than Delta or not. Anyway, let me not turn this into COVID. With gender-based violence, I think indeed globally it's a problem. Globally it's a problem because there's so many ways in which we are exploited. So men are feeling, particularly in COVID, men lost their jobs. Disempowerment and feeling like one is no longer in control of their lives. They're no longer in control of their space where they can go outdoors, where they can meet people, where they can interact. They no longer have control of that. And so wanting to exert control over something, which then becomes exerting control into the home, that's an issue. We like to think that our homes are safe spaces. A lot of people are living in broken relationships. And so COVID exacerbates that. COVID puts a magnifying glass on issues which were already there. So COVID has been a huge mirror for society. And I think all the issues which are coming up, like gender-based violence, have always been there. It's just that we haven't had time to pause to actually deal with it. So it's not a strictly African issue. I think Africa gets hyper-focused because it's expected. Everyone thinks that anything that happens in Africa must be terrible. It's like the myth that Africa is overpopulated. Europe is way overpopulated. But and Africa has so much land mass and land space compared to the people and land space in Europe, but Africa is the one that is seen as overpopulated. Africa is the diseased continent. Africa is the one where men have no control of themselves and do gender-based violence. So those narratives, we need to change them. We need to start telling our stories in context. An opportunity, diaspora Africans speaking about their experiences outside of the continent, I think are really interesting. Like what you just said now about the UK. People don't know these things. As Africans, when we're also home, we're just not aware of where we stand globally. We tend to buy into our own sort of self-defeating narratives because that's all we hear. It's the only communication that's coming out. So it goes back to that thing about storytelling. It goes back to the stories of victory, the stories of solutions, homegrown solutions. If we are able to tackle those stories, or at least have them come out more, I think you get a more realistic vision for Africa. But we have to have the confidence to know that we're not the bottom. We're not the bottom of the ladder always. There's some things that we know how to do better. Africa has been dealing with COVID, the illness, quite well. And that's because our primary healthcare system and our preventive measures are actually quite strong. So celebrating our small wins is also a way of telling our story. Also looking at the way issues of gender-based violence were dealt with in the past. How can we deal with gender-based violence today, taking from our cultural strengths? Not always demonizing the African, not always separating the man from the woman as well, where the man is the perpetual perpetrator of gender-based violence, whereas gender-based violence should really be seen in its context. If a man has lost his job because of COVID and there's no social support structure for him to earn a living, and that man feels disempowered, he is in pain, he is embarrassed, he is shamed, and he comes and takes that out on his wife, on his family. We have to look at why has he lost his job in the first place? Why was there no social structure to support him? Why was he in an environment where his livelihood is the only thing that keeps his family going? Why was he in a place where his livelihood was his only sense of self-esteem? So looking at the structural factors around gender-based violence are also something that is a means for us to solve our issues. I think that's something that we often miss. We often see gender-based violence as just the man being a bad person by himself. Whereas one just doesn't wake up bad. One is bad within a context because of some reason. If we solve the reason, then hopefully we solve the gender-based violence.
Awesome. Yeah. Now let's talk about African feminism. How does it help stop gender-based violence? When, at what level does feminism become a solution, an antidote to the problem that we are facing? Because the reason why there are voices on the feminist side crying out is because there is a problem, there is a gap, there is a disempowerment of some sort on the female side, and there is a way that we look at women. In most cases, sex objects or of lesser strength and whatnot, and we tend to use that and say they are vulnerable, and this is the position they're supposed to be, is for us to then take advantage of that. This is how it meant to be. So when does feminism become a solution to these problems?
That's a really good one. I think African feminism here has an advantage over Western feminism in terms of an approach that doesn't only look at women. African feminism is looking at everyone in the community. You're looking at the community as a whole. So you're looking at men, you're looking at young people, you're looking at older people, you're looking at the intergenerational linkages. So African feminism really looks at the person within their context, be it their cultural context. You're looking at a person's religion. You're looking at the traditions that surround that person. For instance, in Shona culture, there is chiramo, where you have a husband taking advantage of the wife's younger sister. And there you have challenges where now, if that wife's younger sister is a child, you have challenges where the wife's younger sister is consenting or not within that relationship. And so the African feminism would look at that. Okay, what's going on here? What is the cultural context that led to this incident of rape? Say within that Chiramo relationship, a man rapes his younger sister, and so there's no consent, but it's an adult. Let's keep it to the adult realm. I think pedophilia in Africa is a serious issue that needs to be addressed as well. Within that context, African feminism would say, okay, so what culturally permitted this man? What gave him, in his mind, the idea that he can do something so atrocious? How can we correct that? How can we, do we sit down with the elders? Do we sit down to make sure that this doesn't happen again? How do we heal this issue? But first you have to be able to name the issue. If you simply take that man and put him in jail, he's one man, but you haven't solved the cultural practice. Shiram will still exist and another guy will still do it. So you need to be able to then have a community discussion around what led to that acute incident. So really looking at the context of issues so that you're not only solving the problem for the one person, but you're also solving it for the community. If it's an issue of, for instance, rape is a massive issue in South Africa, and I think that's really goes back to the history of violence, apartheid violence in South Africa, where men were displaced from their families, where physical violence was exerted on men in South Africa. And they take that out on someone, you kick down, right? You punch downwards. And so because that was never addressed, there was this TRC, you suddenly had to forgive and move on with your life. That wound was never addressed. So now that violence still lingers and it's taken out on women. That context was never resolved. You can incarcerate as many South African men as you like. There will still be the issue of rape in South Africa being a major, major problem. The issue of employment, access to resources. If we're not solving the fact that we are not earning enough to provide for our children, we're not earning enough money to pay for school fees, to provide food, to provide decent living. If we don't have a country where basic resources like water and electricity are available, those are things that disempower the spirit. Where you have a broken people need to find an outlet somewhere. And that outlet then comes in terms of punching down, once again, violence towards the next weakest person. And that tends to be the woman, that tends to be the child. So African feminism would be looking at all those environmental factors, structural factors, which contribute to the violence, so that you're not just punishing one individual. African feminism is looking at solving the issue for the community and solving it forever, solving it for the long term. Western feminism looks at, you're a perpetrator, you're a bad guy, and you did this wrong, and this is how much you pay. Western feminism says your crime is worth 20 years in jail. After that, you're free. It's as if you didn't do the crime. And this is my challenge when it comes to a Western way of doing things. It's very transactional. It's very short-sighted. It is not to help the community. It's just an isolated solution and then forgotten. African feminism roots everything within context. It roots within culture. It roots the solution in terms of the long term, for generation after generation. How do we solve this particular issue? So that would be my approach.
All right. Yeah. Now, still on feminism.
Yeah.
In most cases, as men, we are seen as people who get to be defensive when someone becomes feminist, and then usually the reason is because women who talk about feminism are angry, are divorcees and whatnot. So these are people who already have failed in their own marriages, and then now they want to come and want to apply this on everyone. So I wanted to debunk, or to attempt to debunk, what feminism is not.
I always struggle with the word feminism in itself because it's an English term. Yeah. And I think this is
African feminism. That would be fine. Yeah, that would be fine.
Yeah. I mean, even saying African feminism is speaking in English. I think part of the struggle with us as Africans as a whole is that now we're living in these defined terms which are defined for us by the West already. Even saying African feminism, it's just like, what is the thing that would make it come home? What is the thing that would make it applicable to my context? I'm going to give a very radical example because I think it's radical indeed, but also contentious in many ways. But I think it points to a lot of our challenges. Right now, the concept of gender, right? Male and female. You have a lot of conversation happening globally about that. You have a lot of conversation happening about trans individuals, about the LGBTQ spectrum. And having worked in that space across the African continent, I've always struggled with the acronym LGBTQ+, because that acronym is English. And so therefore, we're just like, we're stuck with this thing, this animal, this alphabet, which has come out, and we don't have anything to relate it to something within ourselves from home.
Yeah.
And all the expressions of this alphabet are very Western. And so then we assume that it's something separate and far away from us, whereas we've had expression of LGBTQ within our community since the beginning of time, but it just wasn't called in that way. Yeah. For me, it's the same thing with feminism, that we say feminism and people think it's women who want to have power over men, because we're thinking of an English definition of this thing, right? And I think which is why African feminism is important. It goes beyond this idea that came from a book somewhere. It's looking at what were we actually doing ourselves, what actually works for us, what is real on the ground. A lot of interventions which come, and I say interventions which come in Africa, it's just like family planning or birth control. I'm saying these words on purpose because they're English. Birth control, family planning. In an African context, what the hell does that mean? Family planning, birth control, it's these words don't work in our cultures because it's not how we look at the world. We don't look at the world from a place of labeling things. We don't look at the world from a place of putting a thing in a box and saying this is LGBT alphabet. We don't put it as we want to control the birth, you're fertile, multiply. So it's first of all, how we frame our issues. So when we say feminism, people have a knee-jerk reaction because it's a foreign concept, it's foreign sounding. It doesn't resonate with anything they know. It doesn't resonate with mother. It doesn't resonate with feminine essence as we know it as Africans, the nurturing essence. That's why people say it's for divorcees, angry women who are angry at men and want to get back at them. Because Africans, we don't see women as these power riders who are going to climb a capitalist corporate ladder. It's not the role that women had in our societies. And so we should just be careful. I think a lot of people react to something without understanding what it is, simply because it just sounds so different, simply because of the language we use and the terminologies and definitions that we use. A lot of people don't know what feminism is. And so when we're using language is so important. We have to really say what we mean and not only stick to the English terms, which can be very limited in terms of their cultural context. And so this is I think the beginning of why people are against feminism itself. It's just the word.
All right. Before I let you go, you've worked with different groups of feminists in countries like Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. Maybe on a positive note, what is it that you can celebrate from all these experiences and say this is something that we have in common that seem to be working for us and it can work anywhere else in Africa?
Wow. I will go to Uganda. It is a group of feminist men who are single fathers, who are taking care of their children. And yeah, for me, that's a big celebration. This idea that feminism is for women only is completely flawed. And so this group of men, they came together because you have the HIV pandemic, which a lot of people lost their spouse. You also have just issues, be it conflict zones. So these men are men with young children, some have toddlers, some have older children, and they've come together to say, okay, you know what, we usually hand over these children to their grandparents. We usually hand them over to someone within the society to take care of them, but we are going to come together as men, and we're going to raise these children together. And this is a group of men, they sensitize other villagers to say, hey, as men, first of all, we also have a role within the kitchen. We have a role when it comes to caregiving for children. We have a role when it comes to empowering girl children and teaching them about their role in society. It's such an inspiring message to me because it brings us together as people. I think a big challenge we have in Africa is that because we're listening to all these multiple voices coming and criticizing us, we tend to believe them. So you have a separation between men and women. This is also partly because of religion and all the multiple influences on Africa. But these men demonstrate that, first of all, you can be feminist as a man. Secondly, that feminism isn't only for women. And thirdly, that there are good men in Africa. I think it's become too common and too often that we've accepted that the African man is a bad man. And we need to figure out who told us that. Who told us that the African man is trash? Who told us that the African man is violent? Who told us that the African man beats his wife and is a sexual predator? We need to unpack who told us that and debunk it and celebrate those moments where the African man is doing amazing things because he is. And I think we need to build from that. We cannot always be building from a place of loss and terror and trauma because that is not the only African story. So that's what I want to celebrate. I really want to celebrate the men of Africa in all their goodness, because when we have something to aspire to, I think that's where we come out with the positives.
Awesome. Because you're talking about African men raising their kids. In most cases, they will say wadliswa or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm a product of a single father, so I know it's possible. Yeah, my dad was there. Like, my mom passed away and he never remarried. He chose to look after his kids, so he did I think he did a wonderful job. Yeah,
I think so too.
Yeah. Yeah. So before I let you go, looking back at the gender-based violence, we are looking at the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and these are just 16 days in a year with 365 days. How do we take this message and take this awareness and this activism and spread it throughout the year so that it's not something that becomes more of an event? Because most of these things become more like an event. I was talking against Black History Month, for example. I was saying, how many blacks are there in the world? Why are we relegating them to a month?
1 month.
No, so I won't be part of any celebration that talk about my history in a month. So even at work, I told them, count me out. I won't be part of it, because I want to be celebrated throughout the year. So how do we take this message and spread it throughout the year?
I think the best way to take the message is to focus on the self. I think now we have social media culture, so everyone is posting and hashtagging, and we're all out there tweeting, and we've lost the idea of self-work, of informing our individual selves without the need to flex, right? So learning about feminism, learning about gender-based violence, learning about what is the state of women in my country, in my geographic zone, in my city, in my workplace, making a friend with a woman, and a woman outside of our social circle, someone who we never talk to, and finding out what their life is like. I think those individual actions are what will change us ultimately. We can't change the world without changing ourselves. So really just taking a moment to step outside of our comfort zone and say, okay, gender-based violence, this is something I need to think about. How am I perpetrating gender-based violence in my own life? Men are not the only perpetrators of gender-based violence. As women, we can do it too. So as a woman, what is gender-based violence? What can I read up on it? How can I fight the cause myself as a person? If I start there, I think by next year, we'll have different statistics. If everyone were to just focus on themselves I think by the end of the year, it would be a different world. But we tend to be so outward focused all the time. So that would be my takeaway.
Thank you so much. Just to add on that, it's easy to blame. It's easy to point fingers. It's difficult to stand in the mirror and reflect and acknowledge that I think I have a pimple there. You know,
exactly.
But it's easy to see it on another person. So thank you so much for your wisdom and your time. I'll call upon you next time I feel there is a subject that I need you. Yeah. So this is King Boaz signing out, and I was talking to another queen like I always do, Felicity Sibindi, earGROUND signing out, New Voices Amplified.